Is there an ability to find adequate finance at the moment to drive innovation in this country? Dare one say, absent the current clean tech program out of Oz Industry and for that matter the types of challenges that GE put out there. What are angel investors saying? What is the CV market saying around the opportunity for investing in innovation, or is it just still pretty moribund?
I think the first thing to say is that industry in Australia is underscaled, lacks critical mass.
And I think that's the reason that government funding's always been there, to just try and bridge that valley of debt.
Yep.
It's addressing a market failure that I think is a well-acknowledged one. And I sort of think we'll take the clean tech stuff out. There's still a little bit more government funding there because you've got the R&D incentive and you've got Commercialisation Australia.
Yeah.
So I think it's clear that, you know, addressing that market failure is something that the government's keen about.
Yep.
Yeah. So
and the CEFC is going to do great things, and ARENA is going to do great things, but relying on government only sort of gets a bit addictive, and businesses are just on a cycle of taking that next drink from the government, and they're never going to do anything interesting. It needs leadership from business and equal weight in the government, I'd say.
It's interesting, the funding. I don't know whether you've ever heard of crowdsourcing. Have you tried crowdsourcing? You should go in and just type in the word crowdsourcing. There are wonderful stories about that. Crowdsourcing, when it started 5 or 6 years ago, it would take them, 100 or so days to raise $5 million for the projects they have on their agenda. Now they can do it in 3 hours. And so if you're troubled by the venture capitalists and the banks and the traditional methods, crowdsourcing is a wonderful alternative to consider.
Well, because we are talking about barriers now, let's move to barriers. And one of the barriers that I found, particularly in my former life as a lawyer, was the inability of business to actually follow instructions. And I suspect it was largely males that were suffering this particular problem. Lou, and it particularly comes around the issue of R&D, because when I was in the sustainability team at PwC, that other accounting firm, one of the big challenges was to get people who were very enthused about their innovation in carbon reduction to actually start documenting the bugger before they started doing anything. Give us a 101 about what you've actually got to do to get your R&D application right, because quite often it seems to be one of the biggest hurdles for business when it comes to making these applications.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. Document. I mean, it really is fundamental. As the regime has changed over the years, that's become more and more important. And under the current regime, it's critically important that a company that's applying for the R&D tax incentive does have very good documentation. That's the fundamental approach we take with our clients. It's an education process because a typical small manufacturer doesn't really document things very well at all. It's surprisingly how poor some large manufacturers are at documenting as well, particularly well, people in the resources sector, for example, they're doers rather than documenters. So they'll do a project and it might have some terrific innovation in it, but and it has been planned. I mean, it's not as though people just rush out and spend a lot of money. So that they do have planning for it, but the documentation has to be very specific to address the issues that are required to be addressed in the application for the funding.
Tom, what about in the area of making the applications for grants?
in terms of documentation, look, we really, I suppose for just the generic competitive grants that I've had some experience with in the past, it's really been a case of how well an applicant can tell their story on the day. So it's not really a case of having to have, travelled the path of, extreme anal retentiveness prior to the point of application. However,
being a lawyer or an accountant, is that what you're getting at?
Record keeping, I suppose.
Okay.
But I must say, with the clean technology, particularly the clean technology investment program, things like having an appropriate baseline already established and some really credible post-implementation estimates based on a really rigorous methodology, that is very important. So I think to a far lesser extent than the R&D tax incentive, but it's still sort of important, and I think that just reflects you know, just I think well, the R&D tax incentive is about stuff that you already have done.
Yeah.
So you should have good records about it.
Yeah.
Whereas the grants are about stuff that you will do.
Yeah.
So it's unrealistic for us to expect that you've got records of that activity yet. So yeah, I think that's just a qualitative difference between the two types of assistance, which manifests in just a bit of a difference in terms of documentation requirements.
So it's not the difference between the tax office and the innovation/industry office?
Well,
and I don't say that flippantly. I'm just trying to understand. One does seem to be far more prescriptive than the other.
Well, quite likely. However, you know, in the competitive granting space, any claims made, I suppose it's documentation is important to the extent that it supports claims that are made in the process. Yeah. So if there are sort of certain things said, then there needs to be some clear objective evidence that, you know, those things are actually true. So that might be a ream of documentation, but it might be a one letter.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose I don't resolve from the original position, which is that I think the R&D tax incentive does require more in the way of, you know, historical documentation than a grant application would. But yeah, no, I suppose our approach is we require as much as is necessary to convince the decision makers who we provide recommendations to that sufficient due diligence has been done for them to feel comfortable that whatever's going up is a reasonable investment of taxpayer funds. Yeah. So that you know, of course there's a documentary sort of load associated with that, but I wouldn't call it ultra extreme.
There are two elements to the documentation that's required. One is describing what's been done, and the other, of course, is keeping the financial records, which for R&D will require a little bit more than just for plain financial accounting.
Yeah, okay.
So it's about substantiation from the OTO's point of view.
Yeah.